Rama Nasser was in Rafah this week when she got the order. It came from the Israel Defense Forces, and it said to evacuate immediately, ahead of an expected military action. All around her in Rafah, people began dismantling tents and clearing out. Nasser told reporters, "I left my home and fled. I took clothes to change and left. I did not take one thing with me, nothing." She was waving her arms while standing in a main street in Rafah. And then she continued. People are all dead, she said. What do they want from us? Rafah is a critical place in the war. Israel has now taken control of the border crossing there and is considering advancing into the city.
Rafah is one of the main cities in southern Gaza, and it sits right on the border with Egypt. It's grown hugely throughout the course of the war. It was a city with a population of a few 100,000 people, and it's surged to over 1 million.
Loveday Morris is a foreign correspondent for The Post currently in Jerusalem, and she's been reporting on this focus on Rafah.
It's also seen as the last holdout for Hamas, and that's why it's really in the sights of the Israeli military.
But this push from Israel has prompted pushback from Israel's strongest ally, the United States. Wednesday night, President Biden told CNN that he would withhold weapons if Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu launches a full ground invasion into Rafah.
I made it clear that if they go into Rafah, they haven't gone on Rafah yet. If they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah, to deal with the cities, to deal with that problem. We're going to continue to make sure.
I mean, this is the card that the U.S. really holds in terms of pressure against Israel. And I think there was an expectation that wouldn't be played. And I think there has been some surprise here about President Biden's statements.
On Thursday, Netanyahu said that Israel was united to fight. He said, if we have to stand alone, we will stand alone.
אנחנו נחושים, אנחנו מאוחדים, כדי להביס את אויבינו, את מבקשי נפשנו. אם נצטרך לעמוד לבד, נעמוד לבד.
I think it's a kind of moment of taking stock slightly for Israel, and Netanyahu's going to have to make the choice if he goes ahead with this offensive without U.S. support, or he holds off, which puts him under a lot of pressure domestically.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Thursday, May 9th. Today, we turn to Israel as it advances into Rafah. Loveday explains the humanitarian situation on the ground and whether this pressure from Biden could change the course of the war. Loveday, I'd like to rewind by a couple of days and have you describe the lead up to this incursion into Rafah and explain a little bit more about, how much warning did civilians in Rafah have that Israel was planning to have an operation there? And can you walk me through what options did they have to flee and what was the reality on the ground?
Well, it's been a real roller coaster, actually. We had kind of this drumbeat of war building up. And then suddenly this talk of a peace deal in Cairo and this last ditch push to avert an operation. So there was this kind of fear for people on the ground and then this hope over a deal. So and then on Monday, we had a real whiplash of a day where it began with the Israeli military dropping these leaflets for this evacuation order, asking more than 100,000 people to leave their homes. So we had real sort of panic and fear on the ground. And then we had, within hours, Hamas saying they were agreeing to the peace deal. At that point, it was a little bit unclear what ceasefire deal that they had agreed to. And so we had these celebrations in Rafah and this sense of relief that there might be a deal. And then at night, we had this huge uptick in the bombing. And then we saw the first ground incursion into Rafah as Israeli troops came in and took the border.
Israeli tanks have now rolled into eastern Rafah, seizing a key border crossing.
Israeli tanks rolled along southern Gaza's edge, the military, for the first time, taking control of the Palestinian side of the Rafah crossing on Egypt's border.
And that was less than 24 hours from when we had the leaflets drop. So yeah, there was very little time for civilians to actually leave. But one of the biggest problems really is that there is nowhere for people to go. The Israeli military has told people to move to Al-Mawasi, where there already aren't services for the people that are there. You know, there are no bathrooms for people. There's no water. There's no food. It's an open area with really very little there. So people just don't know what to do or where to go.
Loveday, I do want to understand more about the status of this ceasefire and the confusion that, you know, at one moment Hamas said we agreed to some terms, but then it was unclear. And now Israel controls the Palestinian side of the Rafah crossing. But before we get to that, I do want to understand a little bit more about Israel's reasoning, that what the Israeli government has said about the strategic reason of why it's so set on this operation in Rafah. Like, from that perspective, why do they see it as such a strategic necessity to do this?
Well, they've said since the beginning, since October the 7th, that their intention in this war is to eradicate Hamas. And they obviously have not done that. I mean, some might argue that that goal, they're never going to achieve that. They can't completely eradicate the movement. But importantly for them, Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, is still at large, one of the masterminds of October the 7th. I think there's a feeling that if they finish this war before doing Rafah, that will be seen as a failure domestically. It will allow Hamas to paint this as a win, that the war ends when their leadership is intact. And the majority of the remaining Hamas battalions, according to the Israeli military, are in Rafah. The Israeli military say there are tunnels that go under the border from Rafah to Egypt that Hamas uses to resupply with weapons. The Egyptians adamantly deny this, but that is what the Israeli military say. There is a lot of domestic pressure and pressure from within Netanyahu's coalition to, as they see it, kind of finish the job against Hamas. And if they don't do this, it risks his government falling apart.
Yeah. And then going back to the border crossing now, what does it mean that Israel now controls this point, and that now that this crossing to Egypt has been shut down, what does that mean for getting aid into Gaza and also getting people out? Like, what is the humanitarian aid picture there right now?
Well, Netanyahu has repeatedly said that Israel needs to control that area, the corridor basically all the way down the border, in order to launch this operation against Hamas in Rafah. So it's seen a little bit as a precursor to that. But yeah, I mean, the Rafah crossing is hugely important. It's the most important crossing for humanitarian aid into Gaza. It's still where Israel has opened crossings in the north recently under international pressure, but it's still where the vast majority of the humanitarian aid comes in. Aid organizations are warning again about a collapse in humanitarian supplies. The head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, expressed concerns this week.
The Rafah crossing from Egypt into Gaza remains closed, which is a major access point for supplies into Gaza. Fuel that we expected to be allowed in today has not been allowed in, meaning we only have enough fuel to run health services in the south for 3 more days.
And what have international aid organizations and NGOs said about the situation right now?
I mean, they're warning again, as they have been constantly, that a military operation in Rafah would be absolutely dire, would have a dire impact on the humanitarian situation. Given the concentration of people there, we have the Rafah crossing closed right now, which really is the most important aid conduit. So that really perils the humanitarian situation. We've just had the first U.S. aid ship leave Cyprus, which should be arriving in Gaza soon. But they say that this is no substitute for the land borders, where really the vast majority of the aid needs to come in through.
And I mean, this is happening amid, aren't there warnings of famine right now in Gaza?
Right, exactly. Yes, there have been persistent warnings of famine in Gaza. So the food situation there is hugely precarious.
After the break, the U.S. response to Israel's operation in Rafah and where things stand with ceasefire talks. We'll be right back. Loveday, can you tell us more about the response from the United States and specifically what has President Biden said about this operation in Rafah?
There have been long talks between Israel and the US about this Rafah operation, and there have been discussions over how it can be launched in a way that would have the support, the tacit support at least of the US. But the Biden administration has been quite clear that any large-scale military operation would not have its support. And this threat, which has really taken things to a new level between the US and Israel. I mean, we've had this tension in the relationship that's been building over the course of the Gaza war, but this has really taken things to a new level and was a surprise for a lot of people.
And I know the Biden administration earlier this week said it has paused shipment of thousands of bombs amid concerns over Israel's plans to expand into southern Gaza. We had that reporting on our website earlier this week. How should I be interpreting that, Loveday?
I think throughout the war, we've seen Israel ignore the US's concerns and worries persistently. And I think this is the US turning around and reminding Israel that they are reliant on American military support. I mean, Biden's in a situation domestically where he's obviously under a lot of pressure over his position in Gaza going into an election. And I think feels that he has to act in some way here. I think they're hoping that this will pressure Israel to think again about Rafah without actually having to follow through on these threats.
I see. So it's still an open question as to, what is the actual strategic impact on the war from Israel's perspective if the United States stops sending certain weapons?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a case of the actual kind of military material as much as doing this without U.S. support. And when there has been such clear U.S. disagreement over it, just the politics of going ahead and triggering the U.S. to stop the shipment of certain arms. I think the U.S. is just hoping that will make Israel think again about launching this offensive.
Mm-hmm. And what has the response been to these statements from President Biden from within Israel? How have leaders there responded to this?
Yeah, I mean, we've had certainly, I think Gilad Erdan, who's the envoy to the UN, he described Biden's comments as disappointing and frustrating. And then we also have the more sort of right-wing figures in Netanyahu's government. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, tweeted, "Hamas loves Biden" today.
Oh, wow.
So, a range of reactions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting hearing you talk because it makes me think about how both President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu are handling this moment. Has so much to do with their own domestic politics, and that is also relevant to understanding what's happening with this war.
Right, absolutely. I mean, Israeli public opinion might not be with Netanyahu. He's very unpopular at this moment, but he is trying to change that. And certainly finishing the war in Rafah is not an unpopular decision in Israel. It's what most Israelis would like to see. There's definitely that domestic pressure at play here. But on the flip side, pressure from the hostage families to cut a deal and have some kind of ceasefire and get their loved ones home. Netanyahu's kind of saying he's trying to do both things. His argument is that upping military pressure in Rafah is the best way for Israel to get a deal on the hostages.
And Loveday, what is the status of ceasefire talks? What are the main sticking points? Have things fallen apart? Just what do we need to know right now about a possible ceasefire?
Well, we had Hamas come out this week and say suddenly that they agreed to the deal that was on the table. But Israel says that was not exactly the deal that they'd agreed to. There is one major sticking point, which is whether this deal is a permanent ceasefire or not. And the text that Hamas agreed to the other day has an implicit sort of, it's written into it that at a stage there will be a permanent ceasefire. And Israel certainly does not want to agree to anything that would mean, or at least, on paper, agreeing to anything that would be a permanent ceasefire before it's finished.
I see. So that's
Rafah.
the impasse right there.
Yeah, that's the real major issue.
So Loveday, just looking ahead as you continue reporting on the war, what are you expecting to see next in Rafah, or what will you be looking for?
It's so hard to tell right now at this moment. I mean, it really feels like a kind of pivot point, but really unclear where things will go. I wouldn't be surprised if Israel pushes ahead with its ground offensive, ignoring U.S. concerns and threats over weapon shipments.
That would be huge, though, right? If they did that.
Yes, it would be. I mean, I think what we will see is Netanyahu trying to buy time here as he kind of tries to sort of square the circle and figure out how to play this. What we've seen is a sort of small-scale operation into the territory around Rafah to take the Rafah border crossing. I think that's something that domestically Netanyahu can use a little bit to say to his kind of right-wing base and supporters to show that they're actually kind of not operating in Rafah or backing down. But at the same time, he can say to the US and to in an international audience, this is just a small-scale, limited operation, and this is not the Rafah operation. But I think really, I mean, and that's what we're hearing from the U.S. side also is that this is not the kind of large-scale Rafah operation that we're talking about. I think we're likely to see more continued operations in Rafah at a smaller level. It's hard to know where things are going to go. Really, we might just see this kind of continued limbo. We'll have to see.
And then also just the humanitarian situation, what's going to happen there.
Right. I mean, all these other things can wait in a sense, but people can't wait for food. And obviously, what's happening with the crossings and the pressure of the humanitarian situation is really building by the day.
Loveday, thank you so much for taking time to explain all this to us. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
Loveday Morris is the Post's Berlin bureau chief. She's currently in Jerusalem. Here are a couple of other stories I'm following this week. House Speaker Mike Johnson's job appears to be safe. Last night, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene made good on her threat to try to oust him from the speakership, and it failed spectacularly. After the far-right Congresswoman called for a vote, 163 Democrats joined almost all Republicans in the House to block it. Some of her fellow Republicans even booed her.
The form of the resolution is as follows: declaring the office of Speaker of the House of Representatives to be vacant.
Later telling reporters that they were just fed up with what they described as her antics. And another story. Exclusive reporting from the Washington Post reveals that former President Donald Trump made a frank promise to oil executives. During a dinner at Mar-a-Lago last month, he basically told them, help raise $1 billion to get me back into the White House, and I'll scrap Biden-era policies on electric vehicles, wind energy, and other initiatives opposed by the fossil fuel industry. Trump called it a, quote, deal, according to people with knowledge of the meeting. This blunt exchange provides a window into how Trump is targeting the oil industry to finance his re-election bid. You can read more about it on WashingtonPost.com, and we'll have a link to the story in our show notes. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's show was produced by Peter Bresnan with help from Alana Gordon. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Monica Campbell. Thanks also to Joe Snell. If you're looking for the latest updates on the big news of the day, you should check out our morning news briefing, The 7. We bring you the 7 stories you need to know about every weekday morning by 7 a.m. You can listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts. You can subscribe in Apple Podcasts or by following the link in our show notes. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.